that what kind of questions that one could probably raise uh, in following this election. What are the interesting questions that are emerging, and how should we frame an election of this kind? What is distinct about this election is that it is a boringly interesting election. It is interesting because it is very boring. There are no issues. People seem withdrawn. And this should tell us something. Why is this happening? If you look at the voter turnout, going by the Election Commission data, in all BJP dominated constituencies, the election poll dropout is anywhere between 4 to 6%. This is something very interesting, that for a government and a political party that has been riding high on a populist mobilization, what should this withdrawal, this should interest all of you, what should this withdrawal mean? And this is not for the first time this is happening. In Gujarat too, after Mr. Modi took over, in 2009, he brought a legislation, attempted legislation of compulsory voting. Gujarat also witnessed a similar phenomena of voter dropout, and 2009 he tried to bring in mandatory voting in local body elections. If you do not vote, there is supposed to be punitive action against you. Then they brought in the category of defaulter voter, that there will be legal action initiated against you if you do not go back. Anyway, High Court withheld, but that is still pending, that it might come back any time. So the first question that really should interest you is that in a heightened populist mobilization, which is high decibel, we are suddenly witnessing a period of lull, a period of disinterest, a period of anomie, and a period of withdrawal. And that's one thing that is worrying BJP, is because how this voter dropout rate is going to impact the electoral outcome. More than the electoral outcome, as social scientists, this should interest us, that why should a regime that is based on a populist mobilization witness this syndrome of withdrawal? And would this then mean that we are witnessing an early sign of declining populism? That this populist turn in democracy is now, are we moving beyond the populist phenomena? If it is, then what would come after populism? Do democracies return back to the constitutional liberal democratic setup, the way the opposition parties are articulating? I would argue that democracies don't go back to the old centrist, liberal, democratic, constitutional kind once they have undertaken a populist turn. So if it is not populism and if it is not a liberal democratic kind of a setup, what kind of a democracy will we turn into in decades to come is an interesting question to keep a watch, because populism, certain features of populism are at the heart of democracy right from the inauguration of democracy and the inception of democracy. I don't think populism is an extreme phenomena. That idea of cultural identity, the affective dimension, the centrality of leadership, these are the core features of democracy. I don't see them necessarily as anti-democratic character features. So what is to come after populism? If we were to even have a different kind of an electoral outcome, whether BJP wins or whether it is, you can already see that kind of a withdrawal. That Mr. Modi's high decibel thing, it's not resonating on the ground. So there is an overall decline of the us versus them kind of a phenomenon, the polarized situation, all that is undergoing a change. So what is to come after democracy, and how do we explain this lull, this withdrawal, this anomaly of the average voter? Because I live in South Delhi, and my South Delhi neighbors are an animated lot. Often when I go in the evening walks, they have very animated claims about the regime, Bharat has gone global. And to my utter surprise, last 1 month they are talking everything except elections. And this should say something, that the dominant caste Hindu majority is facing an unease with these elections. I don't know how to interpret that. It is not, definitely not a complete withdrawal of consent. There is no critique of the Modi regime of the past 10 years, but there is a complete silence. I tried to intervene while walks and try to ask them, but they are avoiding electoral talk. नहीं अब शेयर्स का बात करते हैं, प्रॉपर्टी इधर क्या चल रहा है, अच्छा अपार्टमेंट कहाँ मिल रहा है. Even if they know my views, they should have confronted me. They should have said something. But this is something very surprising, that this withdrawal, the same lot 6 months back would have aggressively confronted me. Would have said nothing doing, this is India rising, you guys are JNU, you guys are, misinterpret things. But this is the same lot which is completely in a mood of withdrawal. They do not want to consent either side. They are neither critical, nor are they saying that they are withdrawing their, or they are extending their support. So this withdrawal and anomie following a high decibel 10-year populist period is something that we should keep an eye on. I think this, before we jump to the conclusion of that we are into complete crisis, there is something happening in between. That either is it that you are uncertain about democracy, is it that you know that this regime has not worked, but it is the guilt factor that you have supported it with such high level of commitment that now you cannot turn back. Is it a question of moral guilt that people are not able to state openly that they are no longer supporting this regime? And how are they going to finally vote? Are they convinced to vote out this regime? I think this lull partly is reflected in the dropout in the voting percentage. That people do not, and that is where I've been arguing for quite some time, that we need to make a distinction between sense of belonging and polarized Islamophobic discourse. There's a clear conceptual distinction. That people have continued to vote for this regime because of a deep sense of cultural belonging that they could successfully mobilize. So that cultural belonging seems to continue to exist, but offered by a regime that you do not necessarily now see as making a positive contribution to Indian economy and development. This is the dilemma the average voter is undergoing in most of them. That's partly why I feel that there's a withdrawal of. That's one part. The second, you should all look up this interesting survey of drivers of destiny that was done by IIT Bombay recent, one of the largest survey of first-time voters of 18 years to 21. And the survey came out with very interesting conclusions that most of them are disinterested in elections. Most of them are disinterested in voting. That most of them do not make a connection between the services between my vote and the government. But it makes an interesting observation that most youngsters are deeply invested in social issues and are keenly aware about questions of gender, questions of sexuality, questions of economic inequalities, questions of discrimination in urban areas, but they are refusing to see these issues through a political lens. I think this is an important shift which is also has contributed to the rise of BJP and to the rise of populists in general. That reducing all of this by secular constitutional mobilizations to the idea of the political, as against people wanting to see these issues through the lens of the social and the cultural. That they want to work, that the survey says that most of them said that we are deeply committed to bringing about social change, but they do not think voting and linking it to government and linking it to political view or a political ideology is necessarily the only way you can bring about change. They are seeing issues, it says, in their immediate context, and they do not necessarily place it in the larger. Of course, JNU people might want to call that as depoliticization, but that is what the 18 to 21 years generation is telling us, and this is an important phenomenon of what is buttressing the populist regime. That you cannot reduce all of the issues necessarily only through the ideas of election and political ideology. There is an immediate space for the social and the cultural, and that is where the regime keeps getting its consent. And why we still have this doubt in terms of whether this regime will come back. Its strength is in terms of occupying that intermediate space of the social and the cultural. It has an appeal of its own. So that's my second point. Third point, we should also think of, Arish and all of them, Amir have spoken about what's happening to Muslim and Dalit politics. One should also talk of what is happening to the dominant Hindu identity. Even there, I think there are very interesting narrative, interesting dynamics that have come about in terms of how the public mobilization and public presence of the Hindu identity is transforming. One interesting aspect of that is the misreading of the current regime that the temple would be the issue that they thought they would fight these elections on. And it did not work. This is a very important dimension. That the fact that we all thought that this nation has become Hinduized, this nation has become toxic, this nation has become majoritarian. This is an important dimension. Why did the appeal of the temple die out? Why is that this regime is uncertain of winning this election on construction of the temple? What does this signify? Does it signify a withdrawal of consent to a majoritarian state? Does it mean that they want a majoritarian social psyche in the social domain but not in the political domain? Does it mean that development and social issues of economy, unemployment, they mattered more than the cultural and religious identity issues? We need to look into that. But it's an extremely important phenomena that the reason why Mr. Modi is now nervous is that they've simply got it wrong. They thought that they will build an euphoria with building the temple. Then there was Ram Navami coming, and then they said election. So they thought it's a three-way step straight walking to third term. But people are more intelligent than that. People supported you till you build the temple. Once you have delivered the temple, they have withdrawn the support. This is something Mr. Modi himself taught of business from Gujarat. पैसे लेने तक काम करो, मिलने के बाद भूल जाओ. They have forgotten Mr. Modi. That's why बार-बार जा रहा है temple, शास्त्रांग प्रणाम कर रहा है, daily temple TV पे आ रहा है. Except Modi, nobody is visiting the temple. Why? This is something we need to analyze. That why that temple, construction of temple failed to create the kind of euphoria and hysteria they thought that it will build, combined with an anti-Muslim narrative. But there is an interesting other dimension to it. Abrogation of Article 370 continues to have an appeal on the ground. The recent CSDS survey also shows this. Temple is not resonating, but Article 370, they got it right. So they built and inaugurated temple 4 months ahead of the election because they did not want to give an instrumentalized attitude towards the temple, that we are not building a temple for the purpose of election. This is what they wanted to communicate, which is what they did with Article 370, that they abrogated it after winning the election in 2019. That worked well for them. That had stayed in public memory. People are still, if you go out and talk on the ground, the first thing people will tell you about Modi regime, if you ask them what did it do, कुछ याद आता नहीं जल्दी क्या किया है 10 साल में. One thing that they immediately remember is Article 370 निकाल दिया, कश्मीर को इंडिया में मिला दिया. That people continues to resonate on the ground, and temple doesn't. What does this tell about construction of Hindu identity? Is it that we are moving towards a political Hindu identity? Is it because that the spirituality that is expected out of the construction of temple did not really work? Because there was nothing faith-based about the temple construction. It was about certain valorized hubris. And that once you have that construction, that energy did not sustain. So this is my third question for all of you to think, that what is happening to the construction of the majoritarian Hindu identity, and what would that mean for not just electoral outcome, of course, is an immediate concern all of us have, but even for long term, even if this regime is to come back in 2024, what does that mean for long-term construction of this imagery of Hindutva politics as building a Hindu Rashtra. It's not going to be any simple task. That this is not going to be, it's not a given task that once you have a temple constructed, there are other issues of Mathura and Gyanvapi. And this will have an impact, that now they have learnt a lesson that simply building a temple is not going to guarantee you people's vote. So this is my second question. And my third question is in terms of the change that is coming on the ground. Therefore, with temple you can see that there is, at one end there is a culturalization of caste that they have done. On the other end there is marketization of religion. That this marketization of the temple issue, that they've combined spirituality with modernity or spirituality with market, are people rejecting that model? At one point we thought this is a new intervention that this regime is making from the old earlier intervention of strict binary separation between the spiritual, between the sacred and the profane. They try to make that relation very porous. Is that binary coming back? Though the organization is floating that the forum is beyond binaries, but binaries might be coming back. The binary between the market and the spirituality, is it coming? Are people rejecting this idea of marketization of spirituality, marketization of religion? This is a question that we need, that will stay with us even after post 2024. Last point is in terms of their anti-elitist mobilization. There is something very interesting happening there, that this entire business of sending ED and arresting leaders of the opposition. That's the third anti-corruption linked with anti-elitist mobilization. This is the third main agenda on which this election is being fought. And it is being fought on the assumption, on a populist imagery of what is corruption or who is corrupt. That common people in India today on an average believe that all politicians are corrupt. There is nobody who is honest. If you are in electoral business, people know that you cannot fight an election without black money. If you are in formal positions of power, people's common sense tells them that you cannot be rank honest. You have to accumulate money. It is on that basis that they hit out at a leader who has built his entire political career on anti-corruption rhetoric like Mr. Kejriwal. What would be people's response to that? That at one level you believe that all politicians are corrupt, but on another level you also know that this is a targeted, this is a motivated targeting of certain leaders of the opposition. So people are again put in a quandary that how should one respond to this? It's another way, it is a moral dilemma the regime has created, that how do you respond to when a wrong person is wronged? गलत आदमी के साथ अगर गलत काम हो रहा है, what kind of moral invocation do we do? How do we respond to a person? Does it lead to resignation? Does it lead to anomie? Does it lead to withdrawal? Or does it lead to a silent celebration? So this is also something that we need to wait and watch. That Kejriwal's arrest is a big national issue today. It is being discussed even in the South. People are thinking and rethinking that how should one understand this framing of a leader who is relatively honest but not absolutely honest. Because people's general understanding is nobody is honest in politics. They know that Mr. Modi they're happy that he's targeting opposition leaders, but they also know that his targeting is a very motivated targeting of a select leaders with a purpose to enhance his own power. It is not a fight against corruption. How will common voters on the ground assess this? This is also will reflect in the voting patterns. That do people approve of thinking and seeing in it a certain kind of, even if it is motivated, there is a certain kind of an anti-elitist mobilization that is happening, and therefore they might consent to it. This is the gamble Mr. Modi is playing. That for the first time he's making it look as if he's mobilizing an anti-systemic, that he is a political outsider. All populists do this, that they are political outsiders and they are launching an attack on system. Will this work in the Indian context, or will Indian voter be intelligent? Will he respond thinking that this is something good, even if it is motivated, it is doing something good, because opposition leaders or all political leaders need to be taught a lesson because all of them are corrupt. Will they respond that way, or would they think, no, this is the opposition narrative, that this kind of motivated attacks will lead to shrinkage of democracy. This has long-term impact on the democratic setup. It is an exclusive attack on opposition parties. Will they go along with the opposition narrative, which is talking about shrinking of democracy, which is also not an exclusive agenda or exclusive narrative that we can all agree with. But because political leaders are corrupt, that to say that simply to attack any corrupt leader lead to shrinking of democracy is also not an agreeable narrative. So how would an average voter on the ground respond to this kind of not a political, but it's also a moral dilemma they have produced? So my conclusion would be that we are witnessing the early signs of turning away from the appeal of populist mobilization. But we really do not know what this is going to turn into. I don't think it will go back to the old kind of liberal constitutional centrist politics. That is where I think we can see the change in the very language of Congress, that Mr. Rahul Gandhi is continuously using the language of being revolutionary change. And there are also issues that Harish raised, that what would it bring to the subaltern inclusivity? How is it going to be different from the token representative politics? So is this churning going to lead to substantive changes in democracy, or will it lead to a long period of uncertainty where the democracy itself will be hollowed out from within? So I definitely see great possibilities, which I call populist possibilities. That populism has brought in its own way a lot of issues that are at the heart of democracy, which the centrist secular democracy was putting a lid on. If those find a new resonance, even if 2024 elections or results don't come out the way we are expecting, not everything is lost. I'll stop there. Thank you.